Welcome to our channel, Crime Loom, the place where true crime stories come alive. From daring jewel heists to mysterious legends, every video uncovers the secrets hidden in the shadows. Stay with us, because here, every crime tells a story. New York is a city that never sleeps, but sometimes its darkest secrets stay hidden for decades. In 1990, a young woman named Emily Carter vanished on her way home. Her disappearance shocked her family and left detectives searching for answers. For 25 long years, the case went cold, haunting the city like a ghost. Then, a single strand of hair unlocked the truth that no one expected. This is the story of a crime that refused to be forgotten, and the justice that came a generation too late. New York was always a city full of life, with cars rushing, people moving fast, and lights that never seemed to go out. But behind the bright lights and the noise, there were shadows where dark stories lived. In one of those shadows, many years ago, a crime happened that would remain unsolved for decades. It was a crime that took something precious from a family, left detectives searching for answers, and haunted the city for 25 long years. It began on a cold evening, when the streets were quieter than usual, and one young woman never came home. Her name was Emily Carter. She was 24 years old, full of dreams, and worked at a small office in Manhattan. Emily was known for her kindness and her gentle smile. She lived in Queens with her parents, who loved her dearly, and every morning she took the subway into the city for work. On April 12th, she left the office as usual. She said goodbye to her co-workers, picked up her bag, and stepped out into the cool evening air. It was the last time anyone would see her alive. The next morning, when Emily did not come home, her parents grew worried. They called her friends, but no one had seen her. They called her office, but she had left on time the night before. Hours turned into panic, and by nightfall, the family called the police. Detectives from the NYPD arrived, and a missing person case was opened. At first, they thought it might be something simple, a young woman staying at a friend's house or taking a short trip. But as hours turned into days, fear spread. Emily was gone, and no one knew why. Posters with her photo were placed on street, poles, in subway stations and outside shops. Her parents begged for information on television, their voices breaking with tears. The city felt the weight of another missing person, but this one was different. Emily's face was everywhere. People in her neighborhood remembered her smile, and her co-workers remembered her laugh. Soon, strangers also felt as if they knew her, and the search became something larger. The police searched train stations, questioned taxi drivers, and checked nearby parks. But no trace was found. 2 weeks later, a shocking discovery was made. A jogger in a wooded area on the edge of Brooklyn found a purse lying under leaves. Inside were Emily's ID card, her keys, and some personal items. Not far from the purse, detectives found something worse. It was Emily's body, hidden in the brush. She had been attacked, and the case was no longer about a missing person. It was murder. The discovery shook the city. People asked how such a thing could happen in a place filled with so many people. The police brought in experts, and the crime scene was studied carefully. But this was 1990, and technology was limited. There were no security cameras in the area, no cell phones to track her movements, and no clear witnesses. Detectives collected hair samples, fibers, and fingerprints, but they had little to go on. The investigation began with energy and hope, but it soon became one of frustration. Detectives interviewed dozens of people. They spoke to Emily's friends, her co-workers, even strangers who lived near the park. They followed every lead, but each one ended in disappointment. A man who was seen near the subway turned out to be innocent. A neighbor who acted suspiciously had no connection to the crime. The case grew colder with every passing month. Emily's family visited the police station often, asking for updates, but the answers were always the same: no progress. For years, the file on Emily Carter stayed open. Detectives moved to new cases. New crimes filled the streets, but the folder with her name remained on the shelf. Each time a new detective joined the department, they would look at it and try to find something others had missed. But the evidence never seemed to point anywhere. The city moved on, but for Emily's family, time stood still. Her parents kept her room the same, her photos on the wall, and her memory alive. They went to bed each night with no justice and woke each morning with the same pain. The case haunted detectives, too. Many of them had seen difficult crimes, but something about Emily's case stayed in their minds. Maybe it was her age. Maybe it was the lack of answers. Or maybe it was the way her family never gave up hope. For some detectives, it became the one case they could not forget. It was whispered about in offices and remembered in quiet moments. They called it the cold case, a wound in the heart of the city. As the years passed, technology changed. DNA evidence became stronger, computers helped link crimes, and cameras appeared on every corner. Detectives wondered if the new tools could bring answers, but Emily's evidence sat in boxes, waiting. Her parents grew older, holding on to hope that one day the truth would be found. They attended vigils, spoke at events, and kept her story alive. 25 years is a long time, but for them, the pain never softened. What no one knew was that hidden in the evidence from 1990 was a clue that would one day change everything. A strand of hair, carefully bagged and stored, was waiting for the right time. The technology of the past could not unlock its secret, but the future would. Emily's killer had left a trace, and that trace would not stay hidden forever. The cold case that haunted New York was not as silent as it seemed. The city, the detectives, and the family all carried the weight of the mystery. But the truth was still out there, waiting to be found. The years after Emily's death moved slowly for her family. Each birthday and each holiday reminded them of what had been taken. Her mother would place flowers by her photograph, and her father would sit quietly in her room, staring at the things she had left behind. They tried to live, but the absence was heavy. Friends visited less as time went on, but the grief never left the Carters. For them, 25 years passed as if time had stopped the night Emily disappeared. The police also carried the case like a shadow. Every detective who looked at it felt the frustration. The evidence was thin, the witnesses were gone, and the trail had grown cold. The city itself changed. New buildings rose where old ones had stood, technology advanced, and crime took new forms. But the folder with Emily's name remained in the archives. Detectives called it a ghost case, one that would not rest. Some believed it could never be solved. Others held out hope that someday, something new might bring light. In the late 2000s, technology began to change how cold cases were handled. DNA testing became more precise, and even the smallest sample could lead to answers. Across the country, old evidence boxes were reopened. Cases once thought impossible to solve were suddenly alive again. Detectives began to ask the same question about Emily's case. Could her killer be identified after all these years? The thought gave her family new hope, but it also reopened old wounds. Hope was painful, but they wanted the truth more than anything. The NYPD cold case unit pulled out Emily's file again. Dust was brushed from the folders, photographs were laid out on tables, and evidence bags were checked. Among the bags was a small envelope with strands of hair collected from the scene. For years, it had been nothing more than a note in the file, but now it was different. With modern DNA testing, even a single strand could reveal a profile. The evidence was sent to the lab, and for the first time in years, detectives felt the pulse of the case. While they waited, the cold case team reviewed everything. They looked again at the maps, the timelines, and the interviews. They studied the old suspects, men who had once been questioned and then released. They walked the path Emily had taken that night, even though the streets had changed. It was a way of breathing life into the case again, of refusing to let it fade. For the detectives, it was more than work. It was a chance to give a family the justice they deserved. Emily's parents were contacted by the police. The detectives explained that the case was being reviewed with new technology. Her mother cried softly on the phone, her voice trembling with both fear and hope. Her father spoke slowly, thanking the officers but warning them that promises had been made before. Still, they waited, praying that this time would be different. They had lived with silence for 25 years, but they were willing to wait a little longer if it meant the truth was near. Weeks later, the lab called back. The DNA testing had worked. A profile had been built from the hair found near Emily's body. It was like a fingerprint, a unique code that pointed to one person. The detectives compared it against national databases, hoping for a match. At first, there was nothing. Then, after a deeper search, the computer lit up. There was a partial match in the system, connected to a man who had been arrested years earlier for a different crime. The name was unfamiliar to most of the detectives, but soon it would be on everyone's lips. The man's name was Richard Lawson. In 1990, when Emily was killed, Lawson had lived not far from the area where her body was found. He had been in trouble with the law before, mostly for theft and minor assaults, but he had never been tied to a murder. He had slipped through the cracks, unnoticed as the original investigation unfolded. But the DNA told a different story. It placed him at the scene, and science did not lie. For the first time in decades, detectives had a solid lead. The cold case unit began to dig into Lawson's life. They looked at his old addresses, his work history, and his family. They traced his movements from 1990 to the present. They found that he had moved away from New York a few years after Emily's death, living in different states under different jobs. He had married, divorced, and lived a quiet life. To his neighbors, he was just another man trying to get by. But to the detectives, he was now the center of everything. They needed more than DNA to make a case. They wanted to know if Lawson had ever crossed paths with Emily. They searched through records, finding that he had once worked in the same area where Emily's office had been. It was possible he had seen her, followed her, or even spoken to her before that night. Old co-workers were interviewed, but memories had faded. Still, the small connections began to form a larger picture. Lawson was no stranger. He had been nearby all along. Detectives also checked Lawson's past arrests. They found a pattern of aggression, especially toward women. Though none of the charges had been serious enough to keep him in prison for long, they painted a troubling picture. The man had a history of violence. It gave the police more confidence that they had found the right person. But they also knew that after so many years, the case would be hard to prove in court. They would need every detail, every fact, and every piece of evidence they could find. Emily's family was told about the breakthrough. Her mother wept openly, holding the phone as if it were the lifeline she had waited for. Her father sat in silence for a long time, then whispered that he finally felt hope. They had lived with questions for so long, and now, after 25 years, there was an answer on the horizon. It was not yet justice, but it was the first step. The name, Richard Lawson, was no longer just a line in a file. It was the key to solving the cold case that had haunted them for so long. Detectives now had a name, Richard Lawson, and for the first time in 25 years, they felt the case had real movement. But having a name was not the same as having justice. They needed proof strong enough to convince a court, and new defense lawyers would argue that memories fade, evidence weakens, and witnesses disappear with time. They could not rely on hope alone. They needed to build the story piece by piece until it was undeniable that Lawson had taken Emily's life. The first step was to locate Lawson. He was no longer in New York. Records showed he had moved several times across the country, sometimes for work and sometimes simply to disappear into new places. Detectives tracked him through old addresses, driver's licenses, and job applications. They discovered he was living quietly in Pennsylvania, working as a handyman. He lived in a modest apartment, paid his bills, and kept to himself. To neighbors, he was polite, even friendly. No one suspected that he carried a secret from decades ago. Surveillance was set up. Unmarked cars watched him leave for work in the mornings, carrying a small toolbox. He came home late, usually tired, sometimes stopping for groceries. Detectives noted his routines, his habits, and the people he spoke with. Nothing seemed unusual on the surface, but they were watching not for his present, but for his past. They wanted to see if he slipped, if he mentioned anything, or if he kept any trophies from his crime. Weeks passed, and though Lawson seemed ordinary, the weight of the DNA match loomed over everything. The detectives went back to the old evidence. They reviewed every photo, every statement, and every note from the original investigation. They found details that seemed small back then, but now made sense. A witness had once reported a man near the park where Emily was found. He was described as medium build, dark hair, and nervous-looking. At the time, it matched no one in the suspect list, but now, with Lawson's photo from 1990 in hand, the description fit. It was not proof on its own, but it added another thread. They also examined Lawson's old jobs. In 1990, he had worked as a part-time delivery driver near Manhattan. His route had taken him close to the office where Emily worked. Colleagues remembered him as quiet, but sometimes odd. One former co-worker recalled him staring at women in the office building lobby. It was a vague memory, blurred by time, but it gave detectives another possible link. He had been there in the same spaces where Emily walked every day. That was enough to keep pushing. The next step was to collect new DNA directly from Lawson. The old evidence tied him to the crime, but to prove it fully, they needed a fresh sample to confirm the match. Detectives arranged a discreet plan. 1. Officer followed him into a diner where Lawson often ate breakfast. When he finished his meal and left, the officer collected the coffee cup he had used. The cup was bagged and sent to the lab. Weeks later, the results came back. It was a perfect match. The DNA from 1990 and the DNA from the coffee cup belonged to the same man. The case was no longer built on suspicion. It was built on science. The news hit Emily's family with a mix of emotions. Her mother broke down, whispering that she could finally breathe again. Her father nodded slowly, saying it was what he had prayed for every night. But the relief was mixed with anger. For 25 years, Lawson had walked free, living a normal life while their daughter lay in the ground. The thought of those lost years burned deeply. Justice was finally coming, but it felt too late. The NYPD and the district attorney's office prepared for the arrest. They knew it had to be done carefully, with every step documented. Officers surrounded Lawson's apartment one quiet morning. He answered the knock at his door, surprised to see police. When they told him he was under arrest for the 1990 murder of Emily Carter, his face drained of color. He stammered, asking if it was a mistake, but the handcuffs clicked shut. For the first time, the secret he had carried for decades was no longer his alone. The past had finally caught him. News of the arrest spread quickly. Newspapers and television stations picked up the story, calling it a breakthrough in one of New York's oldest unsolved cases. Headlines read, "Cold Case. Solved after 25 years, and DNA links suspect to 1990, murder." People across the city remembered the posters from years ago, the face of a young woman who had vanished. Now her story was back, and the city watched closely. To many, it was proof that justice might be delayed, but it was not denied. Inside the police station, Lawson was questioned. He denied everything at first. He said he had never met Emily, never been near the park, never touched her belongings. Detectives listened quietly, letting him speak. Then they showed him the DNA results, the match that tied him directly to the scene. His voice shook, and he fell silent. He asked for a lawyer. The interview ended, but the silence spoke louder than words. The evidence was clear, and the walls were closing in. The trial preparation began. Prosecutors knew it would be a difficult case. Defense lawyers would argue about the passage of time, about fading memories and lost evidence. They would say it was unfair to charge a man so many years later, but the DNA was solid, and the prosecutors believed it would be enough. They built their case carefully, showing Lawson's history of violence, his presence near Emily's office, and the scientific proof that placed him at the scene. Each piece added weight, building a chain too strong to break. Emily's family prepared themselves for court. They knew it would be painful to hear the details again, to sit across from the man accused of taking their daughter's life. But they also knew they owed it to Emily. She had been silenced long ago, and now they would speak for her. Her mother carried a photo of Emily in her purse, promising herself she would hold it on the first day of trial. Her father wrote down the words he wanted to say if given the chance. They had waited 25 years for this moment. They were ready to face it. Lawson sat in his cell, waiting for the trial. For years, he had buried the truth, hiding behind time and distance. But time had finally caught him. The city he thought had forgotten never truly had. The case that haunted New York had returned, and this time, it would not let him go. The courthouse was crowded on the first day of the trial. Reporters gathered outside, cameras flashing, while people from the city stopped to watch. For many, this was more than a case. It was the return of a story that had haunted New York for 25 years. Emily Carter's photograph was shown again on television screens, her smile frozen in time. Inside the courtroom, her parents sat quietly, holding hands, their faces pale but determined. They had waited decades for this day, and now they would finally hear the truth spoken aloud. Richard Lawson entered in a plain suit, his hands cuffed until he reached the defense table. He looked older, his hair gray and his shoulders heavy, but his eyes darted nervously around the room. Some people whispered that he did not look like a killer. Others said the years had hidden what he truly was. Emily's family did not care about appearances. To them, he was the man who had stolen their daughter's life. Whether he looked ordinary or not, they believed he carried guilt. The prosecutor began with calm, steady words. She told the jury about the night Emily disappeared, about the search that followed, and about the discovery of her body in the woods. She described how the case had grown cold, how the family had waited with no answers, and how modern science had brought new light. Then she held up the DNA report. "This," she said, "is the voice of evidence. It speaks after 25 years, and it points to one man." The jurors listened carefully, their eyes fixed on the pages. The defense responded quickly. Lawson's lawyer argued that the evidence was too old, that time had damaged the reliability of the case. He said DNA could be transferred by accident, that the scene had not been properly preserved, and that Lawson had been dragged into a crime he did not commit. He told the jury that the police were desperate to close an old file, and Lawson was an easy target. His voice was sharp and his words were strong, but the jurors did not look convinced. The weight of the DNA match was heavy. Witnesses took the stand. A former detective spoke about the original investigation, his voice filled with regret that they had not solved it sooner. A lab technician explained how the DNA was collected in 1990 and how the new testing linked it perfectly to Lawson. A co-worker from Lawson's past testified about seeing him in the area where Emily worked, remembering how he had stared at women in the lobby. Though the memory was faint, it added to the picture the prosecution was painting. Piece by piece, the puzzle came together. Emily's parents sat through every word. Her mother often clutched a small tissue, wiping her eyes silently. Her father sat stiffly, his jaw tight, staring at Lawson without blinking. They had promised themselves they would not look away, and they kept that promise. They listened to the details of their daughter's last night, painful as they were because they believed she deserved to be remembered in truth, not in silence. Lawson chose not to testify in his own defense. His lawyers feared his answers might make things worse. He sat quietly, sometimes shaking his head, sometimes writing notes on paper. When the DNA evidence was repeated, he avoided looking at the jurors. His silence spoke more than his words might have. It made him seem smaller, weaker, and perhaps more guilty. The jury noticed. So did Emily's family. Closing arguments came after weeks of testimony. The prosecutor reminded the jury of the facts. Emily had been alive and safe until she crossed paths with Lawson. His DNA was at the scene. His history showed a pattern of aggression. The years might have passed, but the truth had not changed. Emily Carter waited 25 years for justice, she said softly. Do not make her wait any longer. The room was quiet, the words heavy in the air. The defense lawyer stood and repeated his points. He said the system had failed Lawson by charging him so late that the evidence was too old to trust, and that the state wanted someone to blame, no matter the cost. He pointed at Lawson, saying he was just an ordinary man, not a monster. He asked the jury to think of doubt, to remember that the law demanded certainty. He spoke with passion, but many felt his words were hollow compared to the weight of the DNA. The jury left to deliberate. Hours passed, each one slow and tense. Emily's parents sat together whispering prayers. Detectives who had worked the case waited nervously, their faces serious. Even the reporters outside grew restless, waiting for the verdict that would end one of the city's longest mysteries. Inside, the jurors spoke quietly, reviewing evidence, discussing testimony, and considering their choice. For some, the decision was clear from the start. For others, it took more time. But at last, they reached agreement. When the jury returned, the courtroom grew still. Everyone stood as the foreman handed the paper to the judge. The judge read it aloud. We, the jury, find the defendant, Richard Lawson, guilty of murder in the second degree. The words echoed through the room. Emily's mother sobbed softly. Her father closed his eyes, and the detectives finally allowed themselves to breathe. Lawson's shoulders slumped, his face pale. The mask he had worn for 25 years had fallen at last. The judge spoke firmly as he delivered the sentence. He told Lawson that time did not erase responsibility, that the years he had lived freely were stolen from Emily and her family. He sentenced him to life in prison. The courtroom murmured, and the sound of chains clinked as Lawson was led away. He did not look back. He did not speak. The doors closed behind him, and the trial was over. Outside, reporters rushed to capture the reactions. Emily's parents spoke briefly. Her father said, "We have waited 25 years for this day. We cannot bring Emily back, but we can finally say that justice has been done." Her mother held a photo of Emily, whispering that her daughter's smile would live on. The crowd listened in silence, touched by the weight of their words. It was not victory. It was not happiness. It was closure, fragile but real. For the detectives, the verdict was a reminder of why they never gave up. Cold cases were hard, often thankless, but sometimes persistence brought justice. They left the courthouse with pride, knowing that their work had given a voice back to Emily. For them, it was proof that no case was ever truly lost, as long as someone was willing to keep searching. That night, the city lights shone as they always did. Cars moved, people hurried, and life went on. But for one family, the world felt a little lighter. They would never stop missing Emily, but they no longer had to carry the burden of not knowing. The cold case that had haunted New York for 25 years had finally found its answer. And though the scars remained, the truth had at last been spoken. After the trial, Richard Lawson was taken to a state prison to begin his life sentence. The gray walls and heavy gates closed behind him, and for the first time in decades, he could not escape the weight of his actions. For 25 years, he had walked freely, blending into crowds, building new routines, hiding behind ordinary life. Now, every step echoed with chains, and every day was a reminder that the past had finally caught him. The city that once forgot his name now remembered it all too well, and it would remain tied forever to Emily Carter. Emily's family tried to rebuild their lives after the verdict. The courtroom had given them closure, but closure was not the same as healing. At night, her mother still placed flowers near Emily's photograph, whispering to her as if she were listening. Her father still sat in her old room sometimes, running his hand across the books she left behind. But there was a difference now. The endless question, the gnawing uncertainty, was gone. They knew who had taken her, and they knew he would never walk free again. Justice did not erase their pain, but it gave them something solid to hold on to. The story spread beyond New York. News outlets across the country shared the tale of the case that had been solved after 25 years. People marveled at how DNA technology had given new life to old evidence. Families with their own unsolved cases felt hope. If Emily's case could be solved after so long, maybe theirs could too. Detectives in other states began pulling out their own cold files, dusting off old evidence boxes, wondering what secrets might still be waiting. Emily's story became more than one family's tragedy. It became a symbol of perseverance and the power of science. For the NYPD Cold Case Unit, the victory was bittersweet. They celebrated the verdict, but they also remembered the long years when the case had been silent. Many detectives who had worked on it early had already retired. Some had passed away, never knowing the answer. Their efforts had not been wasted, but the timing had been cruel. The current team honored those who came before, knowing that each interview, each piece of evidence collected in 1990 had built the foundation for the breakthrough. Without that persistence, the DNA would have been meaningless. Every hand that had touched the file had played a part in the ending. Richard Lawson struggled in prison. Other inmates had heard his story, and many despised him for it. Some taunted him, others avoided him, but he was never left in peace. He spent much of his time alone, staring at the walls, refusing to speak of his crime. Guards noted his silence, his occasional outbursts, and his growing bitterness. He had lived for decades as if the past were buried, and now the past was all he had. Every meal, every walk, every locked door reminded him that the truth had waited and then found him. He had thought time was his ally. Instead, it had been the rope that pulled him back. Emily's friends, now older with families of their own, also felt the impact of the verdict. Many had wondered for years what had happened to her, carrying guilt that they had not been able to help. Some had moved away from New York, some had stayed, but all remembered her laugh, her kindness, her presence. When the news broke, they reached out to the Carters, sharing memories and offering comfort. They spoke of Emily in the present tense, as if keeping her alive through words. Her memory was no longer only tied to tragedy. It was tied to resilience. The case also sparked conversations about justice delayed. Commentators asked whether 25 years was too long to wait for answers. Some argued that the system had failed, that Emily's killer should have been caught long before DNA solved it. Others said it was proof that persistence mattered, that no case should ever be abandoned. Families of other victims demanded more, funding for cold case units, pointing to Emily's story as evidence of what could be achieved. Policymakers listened, and in some districts, resources were increased. Emily's legacy stretched further than anyone expected. Her case changed, the way others were treated. Late one evening, a detective who had worked on the case visited the Carters. He sat with them in their living room, drinking tea, speaking softly. He told them that while he was proud of the outcome, he wished it had come sooner. Emily's father nodded and said he understood. "Justice has its own pace," he said. It came late, but it came. The detective left with tears in his eyes, carrying the weight of too many unsolved files. But he also carried the reminder that hope was not foolish, that sometimes answers could come when least expected. In the city, people continued to talk about Emily's case. Some saw it as a warning that no crime ever truly disappeared. Others saw it as hope that the truth could be hidden, but not destroyed. On the anniversary of her death, her family held a small gathering in the park where her body had been found. Friends, neighbors, and even strangers attended, lighting candles and sharing words. Her mother thanked the detectives, the scientists, and everyone who had helped keep the case alive. Her father said Emily would never be forgotten, not because of the crime, but because of the love she left behind. For Lawson, prison life grew harder. His health began to fail, and he was moved to the medical unit often. Guards said he rarely spoke and never mentioned Emily. He had once believed he had beaten the system, living free while her family suffered. Now, as the years dragged on, it was clear he had only borrowed time. The truth had found him, and it had locked him away. He had stolen a life, but in the end, time stole his freedom. He would never again walk the streets he once took for granted. The city of New York carried many stories, some bright, some dark. Emily's was one of the dark ones, but also one that showed light. It showed the strength of a family that refused to give up, the persistence of detectives who never forgot, and the power of science to reach across decades. It reminded people that the past was never truly silent, that every crime left traces, waiting to be uncovered. The cold case had haunted New York for 25 years, but it had also taught it something important, that truth may be delayed, but it cannot be erased. The years after the trial brought new rhythms for everyone touched by the case. For Emily's family, life moved forward, but it was never the same. They learned how to live with absence, how to carry grief without letting it crush them. Her mother joined groups that supported families of victims, speaking gently to others who knew the same pain. Her father attended community meetings about crime and safety, sharing his story so others would not give up hope. They carried Emily's name with them in everything they did, turning their sorrow into a voice for change. Detectives who had worked. The case also carried it with them. Some retired soon after, knowing they had finally helped close one of the city's longest mysteries. They spoke quietly among themselves about how DNA had transformed the way they saw justice. What had once seemed like an unsolvable puzzle had been unlocked by science, and they wondered how many other old files might hold hidden answers. Some detectives visited other precincts, encouraging younger officers never to throw away evidence, never to lose faith in even the oldest cases. Emily's story became a teaching lesson inside the NYPD. For the city itself, the case was more than just another crime. It became a reminder of resilience. New Yorkers spoke of it in schools, in neighborhoods, and in news programs. Teachers used it as an example of why persistence mattered, why justice sometimes came slowly, but was still worth waiting for. The image of Emily's smile was shown again and again, reminding people of the human cost behind every statistic. Her name was no longer only tied to tragedy, but also to the strength of memory and the progress of justice. Meanwhile, Richard Lawson remained behind bars. His health continued to decline, and his hair turned fully gray. The walls of prison grew more familiar to him than the streets he once walked. He rarely spoke to anyone, keeping to himself, his eyes always distant. Guards said he sometimes woke at night, pacing in his cell, muttering words no one understood. Some believed he was haunted by guilt. Others thought it was anger. Whatever it showed that the past was no longer buried inside him. It lived with him every day, a shadow he could never escape. As time passed, Emily's story reached filmmakers and writers. Documentaries were made, showing interviews with detectives, her parents, and legal experts. They recreated the investigation step by step, from the night she disappeared to the trial that ended it. Viewers across the country watched, some in tears, others in awe of how long justice had taken. The program sparked conversations about other cold cases, about how many families were still waiting for closure. Emily's name became a symbol, a reminder that no matter how much time passed, the truth could still rise. Her parents watched some of the documentaries, but not all. Sometimes the memories were too painful, the reenactments too sharp. Still, they were glad the story was being told because it kept Emily's memory alive. Strangers wrote to them, sending letters of support, saying Emily's story gave them courage. Some families said they now had hope for their own unsolved cases. Emily's parents held on to those letters, reading them when the nights grew heavy. It was comfort to know their daughter's life, though short, had touched so many. In the community, small memorials were held each year. People lit candles, shared memories, and spoke her name. Neighbors who had never known Emily personally still came, bringing flowers and standing quietly in respect. The gatherings were not large, but they were filled with meaning. They reminded everyone that Emily was not just a face on a poster from the past. She was part of their city's story, part of their shared history. Each flame lit in her honor, pushed back the darkness of forgetting. Richard Lawson, in his cell, could not avoid hearing about the memorials and the attention. Newspapers and television still covered the story each anniversary, and copies sometimes made their way into the prison. He would glance at the headlines, then push them aside. He never admitted guilt, never confessed, but silence was its own kind of answer. The years he thought he had stolen as freedom were now locked behind bars. Each day was a mirror showing him the weight of his crime. Time had betrayed him. He had run for 25 years, only to find the past waiting at the end. Detectives continued their work, using the lessons from Emily's case to reopen others. In some files, DNA revealed new suspects. In others, witnesses came forward after years of silence. Slowly, justice began to spread to other families. Emily's case had proven that patience was not wasted and that no case was truly impossible. Her story had given courage to detectives who might otherwise have closed a file and walked away. She had become a quiet force for persistence, her memory driving change even years after her death. Her parents, now older, sometimes sat together and talked about Emily as if she were still in the room. They remembered her laughter, her favorite songs, the way she always carried a notebook in her bag. They spoke of her dreams, the life she had wanted, and the family she might have had. The pain was always there, but so was the love. They had learned that grief was not something that ended. It was something that lived alongside them, shaping their days. But justice had given them a way to carry it with less weight. They no longer had to wonder. They no longer had to ask. They knew. The city of New York never forgot the case. Streets filled with new people, new lights, and new stories, but the memory of Emily remained. Her face was shown in classrooms, her story told in police academies, her name spoken in community halls. She had become a reminder that time could not erase truth, that silence could not kill memory, and that justice, though slow, was still possible. The cold case had been solved, but the lesson it carried continued to grow. In the end, Emily's story was one of both loss and strength. It showed the cruelty of violence, but also the endurance of love. It showed the failures of the past, but also the progress of the present. It showed that one life, even when stolen too soon, could shape the future in ways no one expected. Her name was carried not only by her family, but by all who believed in justice. And though the city never fully healed, It stood taller because of the truth that had finally been revealed. Years passed after the trial, but Emily's name continued to live in the hearts of those who remembered her. The city had changed, new buildings rose, and new stories filled the streets. But her story was never forgotten. It had become more than a crime. It was a reminder that truth could survive even when hidden for decades. The case had haunted New York for 25 years, and even after justice was served, its shadow remained, teaching lessons about memory, persistence, and the power of hope. Emily's parents grew older, their steps slower, their hair gray. But every year, on the day she disappeared, they visited the park where her body had been found. They laid flowers and sat together quietly, remembering her laugh, her gentle nature, and the life she never had the chance to live. Sometimes friends joined them, sometimes strangers, but the ritual never stopped. For them, it was not about reopening wounds. It was about keeping her alive in the only way they could. Even in silence, they spoke to her, believing she could hear them somehow. The detectives who had helped solve the case moved on to other work, but they never forgot Emily. For some, it remained the case that defined their careers. They spoke of it to new recruits, explaining how patience and persistence could lead to answers even after decades. They told the story not as one of despair, but of triumph. It reminded young officers that their work mattered, that every file on their desk represented a life, a family, and a story that deserved truth. Emily's case became part of the NYPD's history, a permanent lesson in justice. For Richard Lawson, prison became his final chapter. The years were not kind to him. He grew weaker, his health failing, and his world shrinking to the size of his cell. The laughter and noise of younger inmates faded into the background as he spent most of his days alone. Some guards said he looked haunted, as if he carried a weight heavier than the bars around him. Others thought he was simply bitter, angry at being caught after so many years. Whether guilt or rage, it did not matter. His freedom was gone, and his story ended behind walls, not on the streets he once walked. Outside those walls, Emily's case continued to inspire change. Other cold cases were reopened, and some were solved with the same kind of DNA technology that had brought Lawson to justice. Families who had once lost hope found new strength, encouraged by Emily's story. Across the country, her name was spoken in homes far from New York, a symbol of how justice could still be found no matter how much time had passed. Strangers who never knew her carried her memory, reminding themselves that even the quietest voices could one day be heard. Emily's friends, now with families of their own, often spoke of her to their children. They told them about her kindness, her dreams, and how she had loved to write stories in her notebook. They wanted the next generation to know that Emily was more than a victim, more than a headline. She had been real, alive, and full of hope. Sharing her story kept her from fading, kept her spirit alive in the laughter of children who had never met her, but carried her name in bedtime tales. The community also honored her in lasting ways. A scholarship was created in her name, helping young women in New York attend college. It was funded by donations from people who had followed her story, people who wanted to turn tragedy into something meaningful. Each year, students received support because of Emily, carrying her name into classrooms, into books, and into futures she never had the chance to see. For her parents, the scholarship was a source of comfort. It was a way of saying that Emily's life still mattered, still touched the world, even long after she was gone. In later years, a memorial plaque was placed in the park where she had been found. It bore her name, her dates, and a simple line, "Never forgotten." People passing by often stopped to read it, some leaving flowers, others pausing in silence. The plaque became a small but powerful reminder that behind every headline was a human life, a family, and a story worth remembering. The park that had once been a place of sorrow became a place of reflection, where strangers could honor her without even knowing her personally. Emily's parents, in their final years, spoke, often of the long wait for justice. They admitted that the pain never left, but they also said they were grateful for the detectives, for the scientists, and for everyone who had refused to give up. They believed their daughter's spirit rested easier because the truth had been told. When her father passed away, his last words to his wife were about Emily, about how proud he was that they had fought for her memory. Her mother carried that pride until her own passing, leaving behind a legacy of love and determination. The story of Emily Carter remained in books, documentaries, and in the quiet whispers of the city. It was retold in classrooms, in community meetings, and even in living rooms where families gathered. It was not just about crime. It was about faith, patience, and the belief that even after decades, truth could rise. For many, Emily became a symbol of hope, her story proof that darkness could not silence light forever. And so, the cold case that haunted New York for 25 years finally found its ending. It was an ending shaped by pain, by loss, but also by resilience. It showed that justice could move slowly, that it could be delayed, but that it could not be stopped. It showed that families could endure, that love could outlast despair, and that memory could keep a person alive long after their life had been stolen. Emily's name would never fade, her story would never be erased, and her smile, captured in photographs and carried in hearts, would shine forever against the shadows of the city she once called home. You've just seen another chilling story from the world of true crime, but there are many more secrets waiting to be uncovered. Subscribe to Crime Loom, and join us as we unravel more heists, mysteries, and untold legends. Don't miss what's coming next, because in the world of crime, the truth is always stranger than fiction.